The U.S. government says it was able to thwart numerous global terror plots through its controversial NSA surveillance. But concerns are being raised that despite that benefit, the program allowed the U.S. to spy on its own citizens. Joining us now with the latest from Washington, D.C., Christopher Sequoia. He is Principal Technologist and Senior Policy Analyst of the Speech, Privacy and Technology Project at the ACLU. And Christopher, we're happy to have you on our airwaves tonight. I should just remind our viewers by the by here that we are having a Twitter chat on this issue as well. So if you'd like to weigh in, our producer Allison Buck-and-Terrell and our online editor Daniel Kitts are standing by to take your views on this issue. Use the hashtag AgendaTVO and weigh in. Christopher, let's just recap this for those who may have missed what's transpired over the past few days. Last week, a journalist named Glenn Greenwald of The Guardian broke a big story thanks to the National Security Agency whistleblower involved. What exactly did the whistleblower say has been transpiring?
So Ed Snowden, who is the whistleblower, has provided a number of documents to newspapers, including both The Guardian and The Washington Post. The biggest stories thus far sort of fall into two buckets. One is a program of domestic surveillance in the United States targeting Americans, in which the government has apparently been collecting information about every phone call made by every American. All of the wireless companies are involved, although only a single secret court order has been leaked and provided to The Guardian. So that is a program about the collection of information about Americans' phone calls. That is not about particular people, but in fact, every American, their phone calls are ending up in a database. Separately, there's an additional program that has been labeled PRISM, which is about targeting foreigners, although that can include Americans who are communicating with foreigners. And in that program, the government is apparently able to obtain the content of communication. So in the domestic program, they're just obtaining records of who you call. In this international program, they're obtaining the contents of emails, the contents of text messages, the contents of video chats. They actually see what people are saying. And in that international program, 9 internet companies, including Google, Apple, Facebook, and some other firms have been implicated. Over the weekend, all of the internet companies have put out denials and further have asked the Department of Justice to be able to publish more information about how many requests they're receiving in an effort to push back and say that, in fact, they're not participating in a blanket or wholesale surveillance program. They've acknowledged, in essence, that they are receiving national security requests, but are saying that they don't impact a huge number of their users.
Okay, that's what we know. Let's talk about how we know it. Edward Snowden, the whistleblower, what's the latest on his whereabouts at the moment?
My understanding is he is in an undisclosed location in Hong Kong, which is different than the undisclosed location that Dick Cheney was hiding in for several years. Initially, he was in a luxury hotel room where he was interviewed by The Guardian, and it was after he started getting phone calls from other newspapers. My understanding is he checked out of that hotel. We don't know where he is, although he did a live Twitter chat earlier today and did an interview with a Chinese newspaper a few days ago. So he's apparently capable of at least talking to the media and getting internet access wherever he is.
I also should just sort of catch myself here because I used the expression whistleblower to describe him a moment ago. Of course, there are plenty of people in the United States who think he's a traitor and has given up very important secrets that could harm national security. Where do you come down on that?
I'm a technologist. I study government surveillance, so I'm not taking a position personally on what he's done. I will say that the information that he's revealed has been very, very interesting and allowed the public to finally learn that the U.S. government has in fact been collecting information about the communications of hundreds of millions of law-abiding Americans. Had it not been for Edward Snowden's leaks, we simply would not know that this was going on. We've seen hints at this for the last few years. There have been senators who've gone on the floor of the Senate and warned the public and said that there is a secret program that's going on that would shock the public if they found out that it involved a distortion of the Patriot Act. But we didn't know what that program was or the scale at which it operated without Snowden's leaks. It's unlikely that we would have learned.
Okay, let us broaden the discussion now and welcome via Skype from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. That's a couple of hours outside Boston. Here's Michael Vadas. He is a partner at Steptoe & Johnson, LLP. And Michael, in welcoming you to our discussion, I wonder if you could weigh in and tell us what your views are on what Snowden has done.
Well, thank you, Steve. And I think you brought up a very interesting question, which is it appropriate to call Edward Snowden a whistleblower? And I think the answer is no, it is not, because a whistleblower is usually someone who is revealing illegal government conduct or malfeasance of some sort, or government lies. And here, no matter what your view is on whether these intelligence activities are good or bad, nobody really argues that these programs are a violation of the law. Some people may say they're unconstitutional. They violate the Fourth Amendment, which prescribes unreasonable searches and seizures. But I think pretty much all reasonable people agree that these programs are consistent with the letter of the law that was passed by Congress. So if these programs are a shock to anyone, it's because they haven't been following legislation that's been passed over the last decade since 9/11.
Well, let me follow up on that because that seems to be a key point here. Michael, allegedly we know about all of this because somebody leaked it. So it raises the question of whether or not what was going on was secret in the first place. Was it?
Well, the fact that these programs were in place shouldn't be surprising. The exact nature of the program, how the government gets its intelligence, how it deals with communications companies and the like, those things are classified. They're appropriately classified, I think. But there is, I think, a lot of legitimate concern about how much Congress actually knows and understands when it's passing laws that give tremendous power to the executive branch of government. And here, I think, from the statements by members of Congress, it's clear that a lot of people had no idea what they were authorizing when they passed the Patriot Act back in 2001 and a further statute in 2008 that authorized the foreign intelligence program that Chris was talking about.
Let me get Christopher's view on this because you just described it as appropriately classified. Christopher, do you think these programs were appropriately classified and therefore secret?
So let me actually push back on a different point, which is that no one would argue that this is unlawful. In fact, we filed a lawsuit in federal court just last week, in fact, arguing that the domestic metadata collection program violated the surveillance statute and in addition violated the First and Fourth Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The international program, while we may think it is unlawful and unconstitutional, if you read the 2008 surveillance statute, it's called the FISA Amendments Act, it pretty clearly outlines what this program later turned out to be. On the other hand, the Patriot Act, in particular the section of the Patriot Act, the business records provision, no one ever had any idea when they were passing that that's what it would be used for. The author of the Patriot Act, James Sensenbrenner, came out just a week ago and said that he had no idea that's what it was authorizing, and he authored the Patriot Act. When that provision in the law was being sold to the public and sold to Congress, it was described as something that could be used to get hotel records and rental car records. It certainly wasn't pitched as something that could be used to get the phone calling records on an ongoing basis for 300 million people. And so I really do push back on this point that, oh, of course, if you'd just been watching the debate, if you just read the statute, you would have known this was legal. Well, no, we actually have argued that this is illegal.
Okay, let me get Michael to respond to that. Go ahead.
The problem with that argument is that Section 215, by its own explicit terms, authorizes the government to obtain any tangible things that are relevant to a counterterrorism or other national security investigation. Any tangible things. Now, the ACLU, granted, was concerned that this was going to allow the government to get library records. That was what the whole hullabaloo was about, as though the government's main concern was what terrorists might be reading in the library. If you read the statute, anyone with any understanding at all is going to read the term "any tangible thing" as incredibly broad. And it might include databases of information, including communications databases. So if people had no clue that this sort of program might be authorized by this statute, then they weren't doing their jobs properly. And that includes both critics and the legislators.
I'm sure members of Congress would love to know that.
Sorry, Christopher, you said what?
That's why I'm saying it.
I'm sure many members of Congress would love to know that they weren't doing their jobs in 2001.
Well, just take the last word here, Christopher, and tell us, we clearly have been told what the dangers of not doing what's going on are, difficulties with national security and so forth. What do you see as the dangers of having these programs in place and apparently not overseen with the kind of oversight, for lack of a better word, that you would like to have seen?
I mean, this program involves it's been authorized by a secret court that doesn't meet in the open, most of whose orders are sealed and never seen by the public. The oversight in Congress is performed by two committees who also meet largely in secret and rarely have open hearings. I mean, this is, if there is any oversight over this program from those two branches of the government, it is clearly broken. The fact that many members of Congress now are coming forward and saying they didn't know this was happening or they didn't know this was happening at this scale, I think suggests that Congress just wasn't kept in the loop. The public has a right to know, Congress has a right to know, and a secret court that doesn't meet in the open and doesn't publish its opinions is not a court that is providing adequate review of these programs.
And I should let Michael come back on that. Do you not see that harm, Michael?
I think there's a tremendous lack of oversight, particularly from Congress. I think, I've worked in this business for a long time, and I've always thought that congressional oversight was lacking when it came to intelligence programs. And that's really, it's no one's fault but Congress's. And Christopher, I'll take the opportunity to criticize Congress again. I think they're really falling down on the job. They should be exerting much more rigorous and close scrutiny when it comes to these sorts of programs. There is a need for secret activity to protect national defense in the U.S. or in Canada or anywhere else. But when you're trying to maintain an open society, there have to be other forms of oversight to make sure that one branch of government doesn't get out of control. And in this instance, those two means of oversight are the court and also Congress. And Congress is simply not doing an adequate job.
Okay, we've got lots more on this ahead. Michael Vatis from Steptoe and Johnson, Christopher Sequoia from the ACLU. Thank you very much for getting us started on this issue tonight. We appreciate your time. Up next, Canada is not immune from this conflict, and we will discuss what's been happening within our own borders right after this. Continuing our discussion now, there are allegations that emails critical to the Liberal gas plant cancellations were deleted at Queen's Park. An OPP investigation has been launched. If true, what of value, if anything, did those emails contain? And what can we as citizens reasonably expect to know about these and other government dealings? Joining us now to help answer that, from the nation's capital, Michael Geist. He's Canada Research Chair of Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa. Paul Wells, political editor at Maclean's Magazine. Wesley Wark, professor at the Centre for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. And with us here in studio, Martin Redcon, Queen's Park columnist with the Toronto Star. And it's good to have, Martin, you back here in our studio and you three in Ottawa. It's nice to see you as well. All right, let's get into this. We have heard about what's going on with the National Security Agency in the United States, but of course, we sort of have our own little Made in Ontario problem right now, which saw former staffers to former Premier Dalton McGuinty erase emails having to do with these cancellations of power plants. Martin, come in here and tell us first off, is this an issue?
Oh, absolutely, because I wouldn't say that the cancellation of the power plants was a crime, but it was a controversy, and there's nothing worse than a cover-up to make a controversy live on and continue to generate unfavorable news. Given the discussion we're having tonight, what's interesting about this is that if you are concerned about leaks, the best way to avoid a leak is to delete the email. And that was, I think, what the strategy was, or the motive for these two chiefs of staff, one to the Premier, one to the former Ministers of Energy. And the Information and Privacy Commissioner in Ontario was outraged by this and wrote quite a scathing report, a 40-page report, saying that this broke the rules and it defied the laws because they are required to archive and maintain this information in their computers, in the system, and they thwarted the rules by doing that.
Okay, more on this to come. I'm going to go to the nation's capital now, and Michael Geist, I want you to start us off. In following up to the story that we just heard coming out of the United States, we see what kind of surveillance, we now know clearly what kind of surveillance is in place in the United States. Do we have similar goings-on in Canada?
Well, there's every reason to believe that there are some similar goings-on, although perhaps not on the scale that you see in the United States, both in terms of just the sheer breadth of the program, nor necessarily the involvement of some of the internet companies. But what we do know is that that our security agencies are collecting what's known as metadata on cell phone calls. So the kind of information that Christopher Sequoia was talking about, call length, who you're speaking to, geographic information, is collected. We know that it's a program that has raised concerns in the past, that elements of that program may have been stopped in response to those concerns, but then that program has been restarted or was restarted by the Defense Minister, Peter MacKay. But so much of this is shrouded in secrecy. What is released is invariably redacted so heavily that you're forced to really try to read between the lines in order to have any kind of assurance that this is a program that meets the kind of privacy expectations that I think most Canadians expect.
And Wesley Work, follow up on that if you would by telling us how much do we know about how much information sharing goes on between authorities here in Canada and those in the United States?
Well, Steve, we know that a great deal of intelligence information is shared back and forth across the border, and in fact, this is meant to be something that's going to be enhanced under the new border security plan between Canada and the United States. It's a long-running practice between our two countries in the North American hemisphere. Intelligence sharing goes back to World War II. On the signals intelligence front, the sort of focus of the current studies and controversy, that sharing goes back to the original establishment of a post-war signals intelligence agency in 1946. So with that long history grows a lot of trust, all kinds of channels for intelligence sharing, all kinds of protocols, but we have to assume that the Communications Security Establishment, our signals intelligence agency, is very closely linked to the National Security Agency. There's a difference in scale between those two agencies, but they share a lot of information, a lot of technologies, a lot of access. So the upshot for Canadians about that is that to the extent that the National Security Agency is collecting both foreign intelligence data and domestic intelligence material, whether the content of messages or the metadata, as Michael says, you have to assume that the Communications Security Establishment, our agency, has access through those channels to a lot of Canadian communications.
And just briefly, a quick follow-up here. You talked about the fact that they have their national security arrangements. We have CSEC, I guess is what they call it here, the Canadian Communications Security Establishment, Canada. How much do we know about that organization? I must confess, I didn't know anything about it until I've heard about it come up right now.
Well, it's been around for a long time. We should know a lot more about it than we do. It's a very secretive organization, as signals intelligence agencies tend to be. The NSA used to be called No Such Agency. That was its favorite acronym. CSE doesn't have a similarly comfortable acronym, but it is very secret and would like to stay that way. We do have and have had since 1996 a watchdog agency called the CSE Commissioner that prepares annual public reports for the minister and for Parliament and for the public. And that's our main channel of information. But there's always been a problem that's dogged those public reports and the function of that watchdog agency, and that is that CSE Commissioner's Office has had tremendous difficulty over the years in trying to communicate clearly and kind of escape from the net of secrecy. So it's our principal source of information about these kinds of activities, but I don't think it's actually ever been able to do its job in that regard.
All right, Paul Wells, let me bring you in at this point. We know, obviously, now in the United States there is a huge debate about the advisability of what's been going on. Do we have anything like that kind of a debate happening in Canada over how much of all of this should be happening?
No, for a few reasons. First of all, there's a lot of sort of domestic static, other very interesting news stories going on in Toronto, in Montreal, and in the Canadian Senate that have distracted a lot of journalists from this privacy debate. Secondly, because a lot of the systems that are in place were locked in place in the hectic, terrified weeks after 9/11, when voices pleading for the protection of privacy and due process were awfully thin on the ground. And even the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien was very interested in advancing a strong national security agenda with less regard for due process than had previously been the case. And we're kind of still stuck in that paradigm.
Martin?
Well, let me try to jump in here. What's interesting here, what links these two themes, if you want to pivot back and forth between leaking and surveillance, is the question of oversight. I don't think that a lot of this surveillance comes as a complete surprise to us if you've been following the debate about Facebook and watching the movies and thinking about what governments do. But equally, with the questions at Queen's Park about deleting, I should say, of emails so they would not be leaked, the question is one of oversight. There could have been a better way to mediate between that conflict of complete transparency and allowing politicians and bureaucrats and political staff to have private and confidential conversations.
How?
And the way to do that was modeled in Ottawa when they had the Afghan detainee controversy and all of the material that the opposition wanted to have. And they brought in a former Supreme Court judge, Frank Iacobucci, to go through the material and decide what was not harmful to the state, to secrets, and share it with opposition parliamentarians. And the process was slow and cumbersome, but it worked. At Queen's Park, the government's argument all along was that they did not want to release a lot of the material that the opposition sought for reasons of commercial secrecy and so on. And so you had ultimately 40,000 documents released, but the government resisted all along. I don't think the government's hands were clean on that because they tried to hide under this veil of commercial confidentiality. They could have released a lot more. And there is no excuse for political staff trying to delete material that was simply embarrassing. But I think the linkage here, when all is said and done between leaking and deleting, is oversight at the eavesdropping, at the surveillance level, and also when it comes time to disclose sensitive, even political advice, because everybody has to have private conversations. And if you delete, or if you try to release everything, people will just do an end run and not have emails.
Paul, let me follow up with you on that angle. I'm not sure Ontarians knew that there was a protocol in place for what you have to hang on to and what you're allowed to delete as it relates to emails among cabinet ministers, among the premier and his or her staff, that kind of thing. Now we know. Do you know in Ottawa whether similar protocols exist and whether they're being followed?
There's been a lot of cases in Ottawa where, at least isolated cases, where the access laws in place have been flouted, where information was flagged for release and then was pulled back at the last minute on the orders of political staffers and ministers' offices. The current Federal Information Commissioner has said that delays in access requests, which are a legal obligation to provide information that citizens should have, delays are at an all-time high, compliance is at an all-time low. Having said that, let me be government's plural devil's advocate for just a second. The amount of information that's just out there in the universe has just exploded in the last decade, basically since the advent of Google and the rise of all various social media. And a government that is putting out far more information than its predecessors a decade ago might still be selectively holding back information. This government might feel like it's the most transparent in history because it's sending out gushets of information. I used to go to the press office every morning back in the days of horse-drawn carriages and get a stack of government news releases, about 10 releases high, that constituted the Government of Canada's communication with the National Press Gallery for the day. These days we get multiples of that amount of information every 10 minutes from various ministers, from their offices, from departments. And I can imagine that for governments, they must feel like they just need to hold back just a little bit of that, and surely that isn't too much to ask. Unfortunately, under the law, it is too much to ask.
Michael Geist,
Steve,
let me get you in.
Let
me get you in here, Michael Geist, to deal with this issue, which is we've got 21st century surveillance technology right now, and we've got 20th century laws on the books. How much of this whole issue is summed up in that last sentence I just said?
I think it's a big issue. It's subject of a piece that's out that I wrote over the weekend, where if you take a look at where we previously tried to set some limitations, in addition to the oversight that we've been talking about, it envisions a world that is simply far different from the one that we have today. So if you think, for example, around the issue of content, and we tried to create a barrier in a sense around actually listening into a conversation, as opposed to the other bits of information, that so-called metadata, that is included as part of a conversation. And the idea was content, very sensitive, you need real oversight, you need a warrant for that. The metadata, somehow less sensitive, doesn't say as much. Now, 10, 15 years ago, before we had the kind of data mining capabilities that exist today, that might have been true. But in the current environment today, when, as we heard earlier, you can collect all this calling information on 300 million Americans, or 35 million Canadians, I suppose, suddenly that metadata starts telling an enormous story. In fact, we've had a number of studies that suggest in some ways it tells a more detailed story, a more compelling story than the content itself. Same is true on the geographic side. This notion that we will conduct surveillance of foreign communications, but we won't do it on a domestic level, may also have worked at some point in time, a decade or more ago. in the current environment with largely a common communications infrastructure, one in which so much is shared, so much is placed in the cloud, delineating on that basis between domestic and foreign simply doesn't work anymore. And so the laws are really outdated, at least in terms of some of the kinds of boundaries that they're seeking to set, not to mention the problems that we have, the real shortcomings that exist on the oversight side.
Martin, let me ask you the sort of larger overarching question here as we compare how this story has broken on both sides of the border. And that is this. You know, they had a revolution down south when the government gets too much in their face. And we didn't here. We're more into the peace, order, and good government side of things. So I wonder whether this is less of an issue in Canada because, and I don't want to overdo this, but we have been in the past more trusting, less suspicious of government here than they have been in the United States. Fair to say?
No question. We have a tradition of deference to authority in Canada. If you compare, for example, as a journalist, picking up the phone or going to visit an American prosecutor or DA, they'll tell you almost everything about the case. Try that with the Crown here. It's much harder slogging. So there is a difference in approaching privacy, but our laws are fairly similar. The legal frameworks are similar, so Canadians have to catch up to this. Yes, we're not as engulfed by the war on terror mentality, but it sounds as if our communication security establishment does almost exactly the same sorts of things in some as the NSA in the US. So I think the obligation on us is to think about surveillance, or I should say oversight of that surveillance, to make sure that we're keeping up. The Americans have congressional oversight. Ours is much lesser by comparison. One thing I would say to try to tie the two things together, though, is I think a lot of this will change going forward. Thinking about the email deletions here at Queen's Park, I think in future, civil servants, bureaucrats, political staff will be much more mindful of not saying anything embarrassing, let alone incriminating in their emails. They'll pick up the phone and do it the old-fashioned way. American presidents no longer tape all their conversations in the White House because of Watergate. And I think you'll see at the individual side in Canada and the US, people also being more mindful of what they say in their telephone conversations and what they put on the cloud when they're backing up their hard drive.
I would follow up, though, with Michael Geist and ask you, Michael, you know, I appreciate that you're for more transparency, obviously more openness in government. That's your thing. Having said that, would you acknowledge that somewhere along the way, people who are in government, who are the decision makers, need to have some semblance of, yes, we can have a private conversation to kick around ideas away from the public as a... and that's not necessarily anything anti-democratic. Would you acknowledge that?
I don't think anybody is suggesting that there ought to be absolute transparency with respect with respect to internal government conversations. The problem, certainly active deletion of those conversations, is really something that's a wholly different discussion. And then even going forward further to sort of the suggestion that we'll start to see politicians, bureaucrats, and the like increasingly move away from methods of communication that creates a record. Frankly, I think that's already happening. I think of some of the access to information requests that I've launched. There was a period of time about 10 years ago when you got volumes of email. It's pretty clear that once policymakers and others started to see those emails going out the door through access to information requests, they started to take their conversations offline.
Paul Wells, are you comfortable with where the line is right now in terms of what they keep secret, what they feel they need to keep secret to make good decisions versus what they allow us to know?
No. This current federal government is ridiculously biased towards not saying anything. It's one of their most chronic problems. It's one of their, Stephen Harper's basic strategic choices for staying in power. He prefers what game theorists would call games of asymmetrical information, where he knows everything about his adversaries, including the press gallery, and they know nothing about him. So no, but I mean, as several of you guests have pointed out, it stems from a cultural preference in Canada that favors reticence and deference over the open exchange of ideas. And Stephen Harper has simply extrapolated on trends that we see in almost every jurisdiction in the Western world.
Wesley Wark, let me get you to follow up by weighing in on whether or not you think it could have a chilling effect on how future governments govern and how they discuss issues if things were more open.
I think, frankly, Steve, that's the wrong question. And I also think that...
well, what's the right question then?
Well, I think the right question is the balance between secrecy and the need for openness. And that's a debate we have to have in Canada. That's a debate that President Obama, with or without a smile on his face, promised the American public. We tend to sort of dip into this cliche that Canadians are subservient on these kinds of issues. Maybe they were once upon a time, but we also have there's a different sort of slant you can take on Canadian history, which is that we've been affected time and time again by serious security and intelligence scandals, some of long ago, some of more recent memory, including the activities of the RCMP in response to the so-called FLQ threat in the 1970s. And we react to those scandals. The problem is, I think, and it's long been, that the Canadian government is simply too secretive about these activities and has never found a way to talk to the Canadian public about them. Listen, the foundation for how an intelligence and security community works in a democracy is that there has to be public trust in the working of that community. I'm not sure that trust is there around the issue of metadata, is there around the issue of Canada's intelligence partnerships, which became a problem, of course, with the Meher-Arar affair. And to get back to the point that Mr. Cohn raised, I think it is true that we have to look seriously at the accountability review mechanisms. That may be the link between the Canadian and US story, and we're not nearly where we should be on that. Just for example, we do not have anything like the British or American systems for parliamentary or congressional scrutiny of the security and intelligence system. We have no parliamentary committee. Quite apart from the dirty secret that we've begun to talk about here, which is that the Access to Information Act and its foundation is essentially broken.
Okay, we've got a couple of more guests going to join us in a minute or so from Washington, but let me follow up actually with you, Martin, just on that last point. And that is one of the revelations that came out of the Information and Privacy Commissioner's report on the McGuinty staffers who were trying to get rid of incriminating emails was that, yes, there's a protocol in place for holding on to emails as a record of public decisions having been made, but there are actually no sanctions on the books against those people who erase emails.
That's right.
So in essence, they got away with it because there's no way to punish them. Where are we with that right now?
Oops, we created a law, we wrote a law, and we forgot to include penalties. It's a glaring hole in our own archival rules in Ontario, and the government has pledged to make best efforts to look into that. But it's been about, I think, 5 or 6 years since the actual information record-keeping laws came into effect. It's taken us this long to figure out they had no teeth.
Do we want to put somebody in jail for destroying records of this nature?
I don't think we need to send them into a maximum security prison, but I think significant hefty fines would be a deterrent and at least a sanction, and would help to, for example, a lot of people are lawyers. It would affect their ability to practice law if they were convicted and sanctioned in that way. Yeah, I don't know that we need to handcuff them, but certainly take their fingers off the delete button any way we can.
And let's clarify, all of this malfeasance is alleged to have happened under the McGuinty government. So there's a new sheriff in town now. What's Premier Kathleen Wynne pledged to do on this issue?
Well, she did say, and the Information Commissioner, I think, recorded it in her report, that when she came in at the beginning of February, she set up a new protocol. And she did say, I want the staff to follow the rules, but not just follow the rules, but be trained on how to follow the rules, because that was the excuse that a lot of the McGuinty people used, was, oh, we had no training.
Gotcha. Okay, we're going to have another voice join our conversation right now, so let's go to Washington, D.C., where P.J. Crowley is standing by. He is a fellow at the George Washington University Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. He's the former United States Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs as well. So, P.J., we welcome you to our broadcast, and we want to remind everybody that's sticking around for our discussion as well. Paul Wells from Maclean's Magazine, Wesley Wark from the University of Ottawa. We thank them for being there. Michael Geist still around in Ottawa, or did Michael take off?
I'm still here if you want me.
Michael's here. Michael, why don't you stick around for the discussion too? And
okay.
Martin, you want to hang around too?
I'm here if you want me.
Fantastic. Okay, let's get into the paradox that we hinted at in the last discussion, which is if the government can keep secrets, then the public cannot hold it to account for its actions. Conversely, if the government can't keep any secrets, then many government decisions are going to be very, very difficult to make. So, PJ, can you help us understand where the line ought to be drawn so the balance is appropriate on this?
Well, I think we've struggled, obviously, to maintain that balance. And of course, over time, that balance shifts depending on perceptions of the threat, either by government, or by the public. I think we can say, on the one hand, that there need to be secrets. in government. Certainly the fact that the United States government at some point learned where Osama bin Laden was living, that was a legitimate secret and should be maintained that secret until the operation that eventually eliminated him. On the other hand, there has to be a sufficient level of transparency and oversight so that the people can have confidence that government is working on their behalf, keeping them safe, but within the construct of established law. Obviously, this is a very, very difficult balance to maintain. It requires everyone to continue to pay attention, to this effort. We've probably lost sight of this larger, conflict over time, particularly as U.S. forces and Canadian forces have withdrawn from Iraq and Afghanistan. But this is a challenge that's going to confront us for an indefinite period of time, and it's important for us to have proper oversight, but also have that oversight in the appropriate way.
And PJ, just follow up on that, if you would, by telling us whether or not you feel that the revelations that we have just learned as a result of Edward Snowden's, some people call it whistleblowing, other people call it traitorous revelations, what your government is, the information it's collecting, do you find that appropriate in this day and age?
Well, the American people have given, have great confidence in government and have given the government significant leeway to conduct what we've called the war against al-Qaeda, war against terror, whatever the term it is. I think we've had a debate in this country in 2003, 2004 over electronic surveillance based on executive fiat. And in fact, over time, we have adjusted our laws, improved oversight to a point, to where there is a court, secret that it is, that oversees what's happening, and there is oversight through appropriate intelligence communities. I think the lesson here is that can the oversight be better? Yes. Should there be a greater level of transparency so we can have the kind of open discussion that we've had? Yes. Is Mr. Snowden's course of action, taking state secrets and giving them to the Guardian the appropriate way to launch this debate? I'm very uncomfortable with that.
Okay, Paul Wells, let me bring you in on this one. PJ just said that, quote, the American people had a great deal of confidence in its government's ability to prosecute the war on terror. And I'm wondering whether you believe the Canadian people feel similarly about their government's role and abilities as it relates to prosecuting the war in Asia as it has been over the past 10 years.
Well, I think you can say, it's a very sweeping statement, that North American governments have been very successful at protecting populations ever since September 12th of 2001. That still leaves open vast room for debate on the specific appropriateness of specific measures. And just as a general rule of thumb, in a democracy, citizens have to know what their government is doing. And a sort of corollary is that there have to be limits on what the government knows about what citizens are doing. And I believe that we have very generally veered away from that, and that the fact that governments can present a generally clean bill of health in the sense that there hasn't been another catastrophic attack can sometimes serve as a fig leaf for saying, therefore, what's your problem? And we can't let that sort of a bait and switch be used in public debates.
Martin.
Paul used the word corollary. I'm going to be a bit of a semantic pain and say I think it's more of a paradox than a corollary. People, journalists like myself, say that they want to know everything about government, but that government should know nothing about the population. That's a very clean position to have, and as a journalist, I feel a little conflicted because I should be arguing for transparency, but I don't know how realistic it is. It's not black and white, it's gray. I think there are compromises, that's why I keep going back to oversight. I do think that the Afghan detainee process was the ideal of allowing someone, that's what they do in the US as well with congressional oversight. They let people see what's going on, and in the US case, they don't disclose it, but they can at least look over someone's shoulder. In Ottawa, we disclosed sensitive information after Yakabuchi determined that it was worth doing. Look, people keep talking about The Guardian. Let's not forget that the Washington Post was also in on this story.
Yeah, they were.
And that a journalist I used to know.
Second show.
That's right. Bart Gellman wrote a story about how he, for the Washington Post, had to evaluate, felt the obligation to evaluate the material they had And there, he, in consultation with his editors, held back significant amounts of information. And that's when The Guardian was brought into the picture, and they did not feel the same constraint, perhaps not being an American publication. They had a cleaner approach. But there is, let's be honest, a conflict. There is a tension between full disclosure and giving people a taste of it without perhaps giving away state secrets that might be defensible.
So, Michael Geist, do we need to rethink what should or should not be classified today?
Well, listen, it's hard to even be able to be in a position to make that judgment call, since at the moment virtually everything is kept from us. And so that, to me, is part of the problem with the kind of debate and discussion. We say we want to have an open debate and discussion, but we've been forced to rely either on leaks or on heavily redacted access to information requests as the basis for at least the starting point of that kind of discussion. And when the issues are raised, particularly here in Canada with politicians, we're just provided with a generic talking point with an assurance that everything is above board and compliant with the law. Well, we think, or at least I think, that there may be problems with the law in terms of the kinds of scope that it has. We've already established, I think, that most believe there's problems with respect to oversight. And so in order to be able to even answer that kind of question in terms of where you draw the line on some of these things, we need to better understand what even this sandbox looks like. And I think at the moment, we're not even close to being at that point.
PJ Crowley, let me get you back into this because, of course, Richard Nixon called in the plumbers to plug the leaks. Washington, he thought, leaked like a sieve, and he found it very difficult to make policy when he couldn't have private conversations with his own people. I don't want to take this too far here, but you know what I'm saying. He felt that it was impossible to have good policy discussions in the Oval Office if Henry Kissinger was going to be out leaking everything the next day. Did I say that out loud? Anyway, does your government keep too many secrets on the flip side of this?
Well, that's a complicated question. I mean, governments do leak. Are there too many secrets? Sure, there are. By the same token, because of technology, technology allows more people to be in a conversation. If that conversation's happening on a classified computer network, it generates more quote-unquote secrets. You know, the United States government generates 1 billion emails a year, many of those being on classified networks. Involve secrets. So I'm not sure that's necessarily the lone measure. I do think that government in a democracy needs to make sure that the people are confident that what it's doing on behalf of the people, keeping them safe, is in accord with law and international standards. So again, as we were talking about, it's about this balance. By the same token, the question is about leaks is what precedes it. In the American context, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers is the quintessential example of a genuine whistleblower. But people forget, before Ellsberg went to the New York Times, he went to Congress, he went to the executive branch, he even went to Henry Kissinger, you know, who was part of Nixon's campaign, to try to work this within the system. Only when the system failed in its oversight duty did he go outside the system. I have no indication that Mr. Snowden made any attempt to inform Congress or someone else that he had concerns that the power that was invested in him, not as a government worker, as a contractor, opened the door to potential abuse. I have no trouble with his mindset. I just have trouble with his methodology.
Let me follow up with Paul Wells. And Paul, this may be a bit of a tangent on this one, but PJ does raise an interesting point, which was back in the Pentagon Papers days. If you had something you wanted to tell the world that the government probably didn't want to get out there, you went to the New York Times. Nowadays, it appears that Edward Snowden has not done that. He did not go to the New York Times. He went somewhere else. And the Times has confirmed that he didn't go to them first. And if he had, they certainly would have listened to what he had to say. Are the mainstream media, and I guess the New York Times, Washington Post in particular, no longer the destination of choice for people who want to get secrets out? And we've lost Ottawa. Martin, why don't you try that? You're the other journalist here.
I think they are still a destination. I think they now have competition. And so you have, I think with WikiLeaks, we saw that they were able to go online and around the world with a consortium of newspapers overseas. So I think that the Washington Post in this case was still a valid destination. They just weren't as easy customers or as compliant customers, I think. They were more discerning or more judicious in what they chose to leak. Nowadays, you can shop around.
Paul, we lost power to Ottawa for a second there. Did you hear the question that I just posed?
I did, and the answer,
ahead.
and I agree. I mean, Snowden was to some extent a little bit quaint in his choice. Even today, he went to the Guardian and the Washington Post. He could theoretically have just started a YouTube account and opened a Twitter account, and told two friends who would have told two friends, and so on. But the big legacy media still have fascinating, powerful brands, and it's still important to go to. Well, for instance, McLean's, if you have something you want to leak against the government of your choice, we'll take it.
And
Steve,
you in particular, right, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely.
Steve, I was going to say we should also keep in mind that there's something unusual about Edward Snowden, which is that he didn't seem to have an intention to keep himself secret and to keep himself as a source unknown. People who want to keep themselves secret might want to go to a big media organization that could protect their identity, like the New York Times, as was classically captured in that film 3 Days of the Condor. With regard to Mr. Snowden, he had an infinity of choices because he intended to reveal himself in very bright colors at the moment of his own choosing.
Martin, I wonder whether or not people in the Canadian government can say, we may be secretive, as Paul Wells suggests, about a lot of things, but we've never had an attack on the homeland, never mind since September 11th, but even before then either. Is that a legitimate argument for them to make about why they need to keep secrets and do the kind of surveillance quietly the way they do it?
Not really, and I hate to do this to you, but it reminds you that we did have the Air India disaster, right? So we did have an attack involving Canadians,
right.
An enormous
not
one.
Not on our soil,
okay.
technically, but yes, I hear you.
And we have had attacks that have been linked to Canada. So I think I've always felt, I worked overseas for 11 years in the Middle East and Asia, and I've always felt Canadians were actually a bit naive about the potential threats. And I think we've seen with the via train threat of the last few couple of months that it can happen on our soil, even if it's heading to the U.S. So, look, I think Canada has to be as vigilant. I don't think anybody expected the Boston Marathon to be a target. So, without trying to be alarmist about wars on terror, I don't think we're immune in this country.
Sure. Okay. I'd like to ask one more voice to join us now for this discussion. And Elizabeth, I didn't get a chance to talk to you before we started taping. So, as a result, I don't exactly know how you pronounce your last name, and I don't want to get it wrong. So let me say that joining us on the line from Washington, D.C. is the co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the NYU School of Law's Brennan Center for Justice. Elizabeth is her first name, and you will now tell us your last name.
Goitin.
Goitin. I would have got close, but I might have got it wrong, and I'm glad we don't have it wrong. You've been listening in on the last little bit of our discussion here, and I wonder, just weigh in, if you would, off the top as to your views on what the National Security Agency in the United States is now alleged to have been uncovered doing.
Sure. Well, I would like to go back to something that an earlier guest said, Michael Vadas, I believe, said that no reasonable people disagreed about the legality of these programs. That's actually not true. There are a lot of very prominent voices out there arguing that at least one of these programs, which is the collection of domestic telephone records of all Americans, is contrary to the plain language of the statute. Not that it's not a tangible thing, which is what Michael was focused on, but that it's simply impossible for every record of every American in this country to be relevant to a specific authorized terrorism investigation. So in that sense, I think there's a real concern that the domestic telephone records program may have violated the law. And in terms of the other major program that we've been talking about, which is the PRISM program, which targets foreigners. That program indeed seems to be what was contemplated under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Amendments Act. The problem there is what we've learned is that the program, the way it's set up, it tolerates a tremendous amount of what's being called incidental collection of U.S. person, American information. And this is the kind of information that the government really would need a warrant and probable cause to get under the Fourth Amendment. So we have some major legal concerns about these programs that are ongoing.
But if I'm hearing you accurately, it sounds like while nobody's thrilled with what the government would argue you have to do in this day and age in order to stay safe, you are far more concerned about the domestic spying than the international spying. Is that right?
I wouldn't say that that's the case, because the international spying automatically encompasses Americans' information. Not only is there the problem that the government only has 51% confidence that the record that it's collecting is in fact the record of a foreigner, but even beyond that, they then look at everyone the foreigner is communicating with, and then apparently, according to reports, they jump one step out from that to see who all those people are communicating with, which presumably includes a tremendous amount of purely domestic conversation. So I think there's reason for concern with both programs.
PJ, I wonder if you could follow up on that by saying we now live in a digital world where it seems inevitably everything's going to get out. Is this genie out of the bottle, and we ought not to spend so much sweat worrying about what we can keep secret and what we can't?
No. You are correct. If in a world of WikiLeaks, the ability to digitally transmit information changes the conception of a leak. It's one of the reasons why WikiLeaks is fundamentally different than any other episode that we had prior to that, because of the sheer volume of data that can be passed. Hundreds of thousands of documents from point A to point B. We're talking about a discussion that has, I'm not sure I know the technical quantity of the volume of information that is subject to the metadata analysis. I mean, having worked for government for 30 years, I want government to be effective. I want government to keep its people safe. It's the fundamental charge in a democracy. I want government to be in accordance with both domestic law and international law and international norms. I welcome the democratic debate to be sure that government is being held to account. There just has to be a better way of doing this, without having to lay out, state secrets for the world to see, and to be able to generate that debate. That's one of the reasons why, as we've all discussed here, not only having effective government, but proper oversight and achieving the balance between security and transparency is both difficult but necessary.
Well, Elizabeth, do we need to maybe just get rid of the word transparency then? Transparency suggests that we're going to have a lot more access to the secrets of government than maybe for our own good. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't think the problem is with the word transparency. I think the problem is with what appears to be very different understandings of what transparency entails, or what it should entail, among different parts of government and among the public. So I think, absolutely, there are operational details of intelligence activities that need to remain secret. Everybody agrees with that. The problem is when you cross over a certain line where you're keeping basic legal interpretation secret. I mean, that's what happened with the Section 215 program. You had a statute that said that the government could collect things that were relevant to an authorized investigation. And apparently, we don't know this for sure yet, but there was a report anyway, that the court decided that the thing could be as broad as an entire set of data held by a telephone company. If that's the case, I think the American people have a right to know that that is how that statute is being interpreted. Otherwise, we don't know what we've authorized our government to do through our elected representatives.
Martin, I got 20 seconds left, and you're going to wrap this up and put a bow on it for us. It doesn't matter, I guess, if we're talking about the global war on terror or emails related to the cancellation of a gas plant in a suburb of Toronto. This issue's not going away, is it?
No, and I do think oversight, again, is what links it all together. We need to have somebody who is able to adjudicate and keep and look over the government's shoulder to make sure that some people are not breaking the rules.
Terrific. I want to thank everybody for helping us out with this discussion tonight. In Ottawa, Michael Geist from the University of Ottawa, Paul Wells from Maclean's Magazine, Wesley Wark at the University of Ottawa. Here in our studios, Martin Redcon from the Toronto Star. Martin, good to see you again. And in the nation's capital, south of the border, Elizabeth Goitein from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU's Law School, and PJ Crowley, the former United States Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. Good of all of you to join us tonight on TVO. Thanks very much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.